Let's talk more about this bill now. Bring in governance expert, Professor Alex van den Heever. Very good evening to you, Professor. Good to have your time. So is this bill as gravely problematic as the ANC and even the Good Party have suggested in recent days?
No, it isn't. The bill, as far as I can tell, is essentially establishes a framework for considering functions which need to be reinforced or established at the provincial level. There is no constitutional prohibition to doing this, and in certain instances it would require the cooperation of national government. So yeah, post the elections, it's quite possible that there will be a different government to the one we have now, and this kind of discussion might be quite productive. But to a large extent, the motivation for the bill has been the fact that certain functions are not being well managed at the national level of government, with severe implications for the Western Cape. And what they're essentially asserting is that they need to basically create a coherent governance framework to allow them to run these functions properly, especially the ones that have a material impact on societal well-being in the Western Cape.
But what in the proposed changes suggests that there would be a better guarantee, if you will, of an improved level of government sticking to its commitments or delivering on its promises if some of these powers, some of these functions were taken from national and given to provincial government?
Well, firstly, there is nothing other than the electoral process at any level of government to ensure that anything is done by government. But what is well established is that for certain functions, the closer the function is actually rendered to the population that's affected by it, can make the government a lot more accountable. So at this point in time, I think that they're raising the issue, for instance, of harbours. So harbours that are not functioning properly have a severe knock-on effect on the agricultural sector and the manufacturing sector in the Western Cape. So that is a very important economic issue. Energy is a very important economic issue, and it's quite clearly failed at a national level. So they want to be able to control an aspect of energy at a local level, so you can ensure that the people responsible for the province are in control of that. Policing has been a severe problem in the Western Cape, and there have been attempts to negotiate with national government on being able to establish a coherent distribution of functions to allow the Western Cape more control to prioritise which areas are protected better. And there hasn't really been a coherent response from government, so they're saying we need to basically bring that and establish a framework that they can actually intervene effectively. But there are no guarantees. If you fail, you get voted out. That's the idea.
There's also the issue of feasibility, right? Whether what is being suggested here, for example, if there's a clear sense of how it would all be made to work in the best way. For example, is it an easier thing to do versus improving what is already being done as per the current legislation in the country and making sure that that works instead of jumping to another model altogether, and the financial implications if that were to happen? Who funds what?
So there are obviously, so part of what this is, as I see the legislation, is a framework. It's not actually asserting any powers. It's essentially saying that we need to investigate the areas that are important to the province and make recommendations to the province on what should be done. In certain instances, there isn't going to be, the budget is effectively a nationally controlled budget, the provincial equitable share allocations and conditional grants that go to the province. There's a municipal equitable share allocation. But a city like the Cape Metro, however, is growing at a very significant rate. So its capital budget, for instance, is orders of magnitude larger than the Johannesburg capital budget, which is largely being squandered and not spent. But in the Western Cape, the population is now the same as Joburg. So it's quite clear that the economy is generating economic growth, which generates revenue through taxes, etc., at the local government level. So it's quite possible that many of these functions, if they're allocated or delegated to the city, will certainly have budget. For the rest, it's about legislative frameworks. And the province may be in a position to allocate some of its reserve budgets that it might take from other of its functions in order to strengthen ones that have knock-on effects for the province as a whole. So essentially, I would expect that the feasibility studies and the analysis they're suggesting in terms of the framework would make a case-by-case assessment of what function needs to be allocated. The bill itself doesn't actually allocate any powers. It merely establishes a framework for this to be properly considered.
Well, the ANC in the Western Cape says there have been at least, I think, 2 or 3 legal opinions of late which have said, in fact, warned against the Western Cape government pursuing this route. So is it wise then to continue?
I see absolutely no problem with it. Many countries around the world have an array of functional distributions between a national, a provincial and a municipal level of government. It's something that needs to change on an ongoing basis in any society. What we have seen is that certain national functions have catastrophically failed across the country. And this is a problem because sometimes they are over-centralized. The departments you have no option if they fail. So it is possible for another level of government to actually run them effectively. Now, I don't know what those legal opinions are, but I certainly can't see where any legal opinion can say that this framework legislation is in any way unconstitutional, because there is nothing that allocates these functions to the national level of government, and there's nothing that prohibits the allocation of further functions to provinces or municipalities. That really becomes part of an ongoing process of legislation making, which is what we expect of government bodies. And I think that it's a good thing. It's important to dynamically build our legislative frameworks so that we've got more coherent structures and not assume that the structure that we kind of came up with in 1994 is the one we will have for the next 100 years. That doesn't make sense. The distribution of functions in many countries is a lot more distributed than in South Africa, and that's one of the reasons why we have such inconsistent delivery. So in the Western Cape, the railway services, the logistics systems, the passenger rail, the public transport, the roads, etc., are critically important to the province, and it just wants to have a degree of control over those functions. So this is not unusual. So part of what their evaluation requirements are in the framework is to actually do effective studies that give them clear advice on whether or not a function should be shifted or not, and also advise on which process they should follow to have the function allocated to a particular level of government.
Okay.
And it includes what would effectively be asking the National Council of Provinces to delegate this function. Now, the ANC would oppose that under the current government, but I think that we might end up with a more mature government post 2020, during 2024, and these conversations will become more routine.
The other problem, more immediately, I suppose, at the moment, the Western Cape, according to all forecasts, will likely go back to governance under the DA post the 2024 election, right? But when you look at the timeline as to where we are now, how much could change that could alter the possibility of this process moving rather significantly in any way?
Well, I think that there's nothing stopping this legislation from being passed at the provincial level. It can be, because it doesn't actually allocate any powers. What it's basically doing is establishing a framework. When you actually start to engage on the process of function shifting, you're obviously going to encounter challenges at different levels. So it really depends on the basis for the challenge. So this will probably be on a case-by-case basis. And part of what I expect the DA and the Western Cape are thinking is that, to a large extent, where national government has materially failed, in other words, the evidence is very, very clear, they will be arguing that this function is appropriately allocated to their level because national government isn't performing, and therefore it is appropriate that they are able to exercise a degree of control. Mm. It will be an important deliberation, because many of these functions do need to be distributed, and it's not just within the Western Cape. They need to be distributed in many other provinces as well. So I think that we need to have certain functions delivered at a provincial level more than we have at the moment, and more at local government. But obviously the performance depends fundamentally in South Africa on the electoral process and the extent to which voters actually take performance of what their province or their local government is doing into account when they choose who are political leaders. If you don't do that, nothing works.
So the Western Cape, lastly, Professor, because we're running out of time, the Western Cape, as we know, is repeatedly, constantly, in fact, under scrutiny for, especially around Cape Town, being a tale of two places, right, realities, where if you are middle class, rich, live in the suburbs, you're guaranteed a city that works almost perfectly in Cape Town. But if you're in the townships and in other poorer areas, the reality is completely different. What in this bill speaks to that challenge?
Well, I think that what they would be arguing is that certain of those functions in certain of those areas are actually controlled by National, and therefore they don't have complete control over what happens within housing and water, etc., and energy to the extent that they could improve on it. So that would be one of their arguments. But one of the important things to note is that, in terms of where things work and they don't, I mean, if you sit in Gauteng, I'm sorry, it's appalling the diversity of performance. Well, we do see that even in the suburbs, the services and functions are failing drastically, but they're failing everywhere else as well. So I think that the issue of making sure that we make government perform it in every area is critical. And in the Western Cape, if the DA doesn't address areas that are lower income, etc., that can perform better, well, guess what? Lower income population dominates. You're not going to be in power for very long. So it really is in the interests of every province to make sure you're serving the entire population and not just the elite. So this is going to be a conversation not for the Western Cape. It's for everywhere. And I'm afraid government to date has certainly failed in providing services, functions, jobs, etc. to the broader population. So at this point in time, nobody looks good. But the Western Cape, in terms of general functionality, certainly massively outperforms the other provinces and the metros as well.
Alex from Heever, get to speak to you, governance expert, speaking to us on Newzroom Afrika.